Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijfijken and I work at the Transnational NGO Initiative, and today we have a very interesting visitor with us, Shayna Plaut. I hope I pronounced your last name okay. And Shayna, you are a doctoral candidate at the University of British Columbia, is that right?
That's correct.
But you're also a visiting fellow at Columbia University at
the Institute for the Study of Human Rights.
Right. And you have worked both as a practitioner and now as a PhD student in academia on the interesting nexus between human rights, public education, and journalism now most recently. So our interview will focus around those issues. Tell me a little bit more about the nature of the issues that you work on, and how did you get to work on those?
Sure, and I want to say thank you for this opportunity. And one of the things that I think is most important when you're doing human rights work is actually being able to have the ability of listening to other people's stories in the kind of the work that they're doing and how they got there. Journalism is actually my first love. I started my first newspaper when I was 9 years old. I started my first underground radical punk rock magazine when I was 14. So I've always been extremely interested in how people represent themselves. At the same time, I grew up in Los Angeles, California, in a high school of 43 languages spoken in my high school. And if you translate my name, it actually means beautiful refugee. So I've also always had an interest in people who don't fit well into the traditional understanding of the nation state. And as I continued in my own academia, in my own schooling, I realized it was very easy for people to talk about what they were against, but quite difficult for people to talk about what they were for, what alternatives could be. So almost all of my academic work, but also a good focus of my practitioner-based work, has been working with people to articulate their own visions of what problems are, but also what solutions could look like, and being able to work with people so they can articulate that to another audience.
I see.
So what that means in practitioner work is when I was working with Amnesty International as the Human Rights Education Coordinator, I worked with high school teachers in inner city high schools, and I use that term knowing all the loaded languages that means, but I worked with high school teachers in inner city high schools, and I also worked with university students or graduate students or recent graduates who wanted to teach human rights in inner city high schools. And I paired them up so that you would have these college graduate, early mid-20s, late teens, probably the age of some of the students you work with, be teaching a course on human rights once a week, one period a week, in the high schools that did not have Amnesty International groups, that did not have those resources, that would not have those kinds of experiences normally. But instead of having a separate human rights class, we'd work together with the teacher to integrate it into US history, Latin American history, Chinese language, art, African American studies, and we would integrate it in there. So you didn't have the War of 1812 on Monday, female genital cutting in Malawi on Tuesday, and the War of 1812 on Wednesday. And what happened is that the final project that these students would make in their own medium that they would choose really got me more and more interested in how you teach human rights in a way that people can then adapt it in their own way and explain it in their own language.
So it's both the teaching of, but also how people can translate that perspective and knowledge into ways of articulating their own identity in a transnational space, also to others, as you said in the beginning of our interview. Very interesting. So, as you know, we in the Transnational NGO Initiative are interested in NGOs as actors in global governance. In the space of both human rights, public education, as well as journalism, how do you see their role? You've worked for Amnesty, but how do you see now also in your academic research on human rights and journalism and the nexus between those two? What is the role of NGOs? What is their effectiveness or lack thereof? What can you say about that?
Sure. So my academic research actually is answering a hesitation or resistance that I had with my colleagues. I taught at Columbia College Chicago for many years. I taught human rights to future journalists, producers of culture, and it was so popular that I reached out to my colleagues and said, I'll teach you the basics of human rights. You teach some courses on human rights to these future journalists and other producers of cultures. And to a man and a woman, every single one said no. They wouldn't do it because of objectivity, because they needed to be objective. They couldn't teach human rights as journalism professors because that wouldn't be objective. This brought me to my academic research, which is looking at how can you teach journalism in a way and do journalism. How can you teach journalism and how can you do journalism in a way that is credible without pretending to be neutral? What is a way of being able to see that? And because of my interest in transnational peoples, I chose two very divergent transnational peoples to look at. One is the Sami, the indigenous people in the modern day countries of Norway, Finland, Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia, and the other are Roma. I've worked with Romani media, Gypsy media for the past 12, 13 years, since 2001. Roma media is all funded through funders and almost all done through NGOs.
And OSF, I think, is a big funder.
Open Society Foundation is by far the most consistent funder. At this point, they're not the most generous funder because many of the countries where Roma live are actually in the European Union, but they are by far the most consistent funder and the most flexible. So Sami media is almost all, actually, is all funded by states in one way or another. Whereas Roma media, it's all foundations done through NGOs. It's very, very interesting to see the challenges and the tensions that happen when you compare these two. And here I'm talking specifically about the role of funding and execution. Some would say that the fact that Sami media is all funded through states, what about independence, especially when you're talking about journalism? How does that actually work? And I think there we have to be careful not having a US model of what it means to have a public funding. That question, that quandary, which is something I have, is not something that was expressed nearly as much by folks there. With Roma media, the issue has to do with survival. Because of this constant need of surviving as an institution, as a training institution, as a media institution, as a media outlet, there isn't necessarily the development of a solid form of journalism. So things become very project-driven. And it's extremely project-driven, and therefore you don't have the consistency of actually building that fifth estate that journalism is supposed to be. Then there's also questions about independence, but I actually found that the issues of independence wasn't so much we're being told what to do as we assume we need to speak to the call for proposals. We assume we cannot build an institution. We assume we cannot build infrastructure. We're not given seed money. We're given stuff on how to cover Roma health. We're not given stuff on how to cover the electric bill. So then the question becomes, what are other possibilities? And that is what people are struggling with a lot. And how does that work with journalism?
This is quite interesting. I do want to return, though, for a moment to this issue, the challenge you threw up, which is how can you credibly, as a journalist, report on human rights without claiming to be objective? Can you, in a nutshell...
That's not what I said.
Okay, what did you say?
I said, how can you be credible without pretending to be neutral?
Neutral.
And part of the issue is because of these different understandings of objectivity.
Okay. So tell me a little bit more about how you can towards the end of this interview.
Sure. So when we talk about objectivity, and especially within journalism, we're often talking about only a positivist notion of objectivity. So it's something that was put up by Walter Lippmann, which is a very scientific approach. We stand on the side, we watch the world, and we report on the world as it is, to the people. And that doesn't really work very well in science, which actually science has acknowledged. And that doesn't really work well in social sciences, which social science has acknowledged. But for some reason, in journalism, that's still held as the mantra. And there's a great quote called, "Objectivity is the god that won't die." I wish I said it, but I didn't. It was Hackett and Zhao. And what I am positing is that there's other ways that you can look at objectivity. And borrowing from some feminist scholars, and also borrowing from post-colonial scholars, and one of the most interesting is this idea of contextual objectivity, which is put forward by Al-Nawi and Iskander when they were answering the question, is Al Jazeera objective? And they were answering it in 2001, so Al Jazeera was only in Arabic at the time. Is Al Jazeera objective? They wrote in 2002, they said, yes, Al Jazeera is objective if you're talking about the fact that they know they're speaking to an Arabic-speaking audience. So understanding the context of their audience. And that they are also journalists who are reporting from the Arab world, and they are from the Arab world. So the context of the journalists themselves. If we pay attention to what the context is, then it is objective within that context. At the same time, strong objectivity says, if you pay attention from, and you start a story from people who are not benefiting from the status quo, who are not benefiting from that which is. If you want to describe a building and you pay attention, start with the person who's in the wheelchair or the janitor, rather than the architect or the president of that building. You'll actually get a more complete view. And my understanding of human rights journalism is that you still need to have good journalism. You need to have credibility, you need to have multiple sources, you need to have transparency in your sources. But you also need to have contextual objectivity, and you also need to have strong objectivity. You put those three together and you have the foundation for what could be human rights journalism.
I see. And so then I have to come with my last question, can't help it. So what can NGOs, if I can call them NGOs like IPS, or an IREX, for instance, that does a lot of work, as I understand, at least in this space, and it's not my area of specialization. What can they learn? What are the implications of your research for them, for how they should be a channel for news from their constituents?
Good, very good question. So they would consider themselves probably media development agencies. And there's a growing industry of media development agencies. Many people are saying that it's because mainstream media is going through such a business model and economic shift that what's ended up happening is that you have something called more philanthrojournalism.
I see.
Where philanthropic organizations are actually sponsoring either the reporting of particular issues or particular beats. And I am making a distinction there between issues and beats.
What are beats?
So beats would be like the Ford Foundation will fund Marketplace to be able to do labor reporting, or poverty and rich reporting. So they're not saying cover this story, they're saying cover this topic, this subject, this lens, right? As opposed to the MacArthur Foundation, for instance, which would say we want to do stories on extractive industries. That's much more a story-specific thing. Media development is probably, give or take, about 15, 20 years old, depending on where you are. I'm more comfortable talking about it from Central Eastern Europe because that's what I know. And I think that they failed. I think that they have failed because they are trying to fund too many projects without a clear vision of what they want the end result to be.
I see.
Is it that you want to make media outlets to be able to serve a particular constituency? Or is it that you want to make stories in mainstream outlets to be able to serve the widest constituency? Or is it that you want to make new journalists that can work in either ethnic-specific media, topic-specific media, or mainstream media? Or is it that you want to bolster mainstream media in general to then be able to know, and the journalists there to be able to cover all of these various topics? The media development agencies, in my opinion, don't know what they want, so they funded everything.
And so they funded a model, a mix of these different things, but there's no clear strategy and no clear articulation of outcomes that they want to achieve.
And they funded it based on projects as opposed to funding it based on infrastructure.
Core infrastructure.
Core infrastructure, so that when they leave, there can still be something to remain.
And that's a classical issue.
Absolutely.
In many forms of international development aid, if you will. So on that note...
May I say one thing? And I think the one thing that's particular here, because it could be development aid, but when you're talking about the transmission of information, when you're talking about the transmission of knowledge, and you want people to be listening to you, the most important thing is consistency. It's a brand loyalty of knowing that that's where I can turn to for information. If you're inconsistent in terms of the quality and the consistency of your information, then you've failed.
Okay. A lot to think about. Thank you. This has been a very rich interview.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
You're welcome.